Welcome to our channel, where history's turning points come alive. Today we journey into the gripping final chapter of Thomas Cromwell's rise and fall. From blacksmith's son to Henry VIII's most powerful minister, Cromwell reshaped England, but on Tower Hill, his fate was sealed in betrayal, power, and execution. The fall of Thomas Cromwell, arrest, betrayal, and execution under Henry VIII. Thomas Cromwell's story begins in the unlikeliest of places, far removed from the golden courts and perfumed chambers of Tudor power, for he was born around 1485 in the rough London neighborhood of Putney, the son of Walter Cromwell, a blacksmith and sometime brewer with a reputation for brawling, debts, and brushes with the law. A childhood that left Thomas marked by hardship and an early awareness of how precarious life could be for those of modest standing, yet it was precisely these conditions that cultivated in him a toughness, resilience, and practical cunning that would later define his meteoric rise, because unlike many of his contemporaries who entered politics through noble birth or inherited connections, Cromwell had no such safety net and was forced from the beginning to rely on his wits, his adaptability, and an iron determination to climb beyond the station into which he had been born. The London of Cromwell's youth was not the glittering capital of Elizabethan fame, but rather a city of narrow alleys, crowded markets, noisy workshops, and the smell of industry, where the River Thames brought both opportunity and danger, since trade meant prosperity but poverty and disease haunted the cramped neighborhoods. And in this setting young Thomas would have witnessed firsthand the sharp divisions between the comfortable lives of merchants and the brutal labor of the working poor. A contrast that may have sharpened his later ability to navigate between different classes with ease, speaking the language of guildsmen as confidently as that of noblemen, a skill that allowed him to blend into whatever circle he needed for advantage. Little is known of his formal education, if any, but what is clear is that Cromwell possessed an appetite for knowledge that defied his environment, likely learning arithmetic, some Latin, and the rudiments of law and commerce either through local schooling or self-taught methods, though later observers marveled at his memory and his capacity to absorb detail, qualities essential for a man who would one day manage the king's complex affairs of state. And if his rough beginnings left him with scars, they also gave him empathy for the underdog and suspicion toward those who dismissed men of humble birth, sentiments that colored many of his later reforms in law and church governance. In these early years, Cromwell's temperament was already forming into something formidable, for accounts suggest he was quick to seize opportunity, unafraid of risk, and willing to work tirelessly for advancement, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the indolence of many minor gentry youths who squandered fortunes at court, and by his teenage years he had grown restless, chafing at the limits of his father's world. So restless, in fact, that by around the age of 15 or 16 he took the bold step of leaving England altogether, venturing first into the service of mercenaries and later into the bustling trade hubs of continental Europe, an extraordinary leap for the son of a London blacksmith, one that would expose him to the cosmopolitan cultures, languages, and ideas that shaped his worldview in ways unimaginable to his peers who never crossed the Channel. Cromwell's departure from England marked the first decisive break in his life, an act of self-invention that foreshadowed the transformations he would orchestrate for England itself decades later, for in abandoning the limited prospects of Putney he set his eyes upon the broader horizons of Italy and the Low Countries, where he would learn commerce, finance, and diplomacy, skills alien to many English courtiers but essential for navigating the shifting power structures of Renaissance Europe. And if his beginnings were humble, it was this outward-looking curiosity and fearless embrace of foreign worlds that turned him into more than just another ambitious Londoner, transforming him into a man whose reach and understanding extended far beyond the parochialism of Tudor society. The shadow of his father, Walter, lingered nonetheless, a reminder of the rough justice and volatile tempers that could ruin families in an instant, and perhaps Thomas carried with him both resentment and determination to escape that legacy, for while Walter was fined, punished, and often ridiculed for his misdemeanors, the son would one day become the most feared administrator of a realm, able to bend the law to his king's will with ruthless efficiency, suggesting that early exposure to disorder and punishment may have convinced him of the necessity of control, order, and authority, lessons he never forgot as he climbed from obscurity to supremacy. As he sailed away from England's shores to seek his fortune abroad, Cromwell likely understood that survival would depend on his ability to learn languages, adapt to new customs, and prove useful to men of greater rank, and in this determination he already displayed the hallmarks of the statesman he would become: resourcefulness, pragmatism, and an instinct for aligning himself with power without ever appearing to challenge it directly, a delicate balancing act that in time would make him indispensable to Henry VIII, Yet in these earliest days he was simply a nameless adventurer, armed only with grit and ambition, stepping into a world that would teach him commerce in Antwerp, strategy in Florence, and law in the bustling mercantile courts of Italy. Thus the boy from Putney was reborn as a traveler and apprentice of Europe, his eyes widened by the wealth of Italian banking houses, the sophistication of Florentine politics, and the mercantile power of the Netherlands, experiences that forged him into something England rarely produced in the 15th century, a worldly statesman in embryo, a man of both the sword and the ledger, comfortable with both the rough bargaining of merchants and the elegant rhetoric of scholars, and though his name was still unknown in England, he had already set upon the path that would bring him back not as a blacksmith's son but as one of the most formidable architects of Tudor power. When Thomas Cromwell left the streets of Putney behind, his footsteps carried him into the dynamic world of continental Europe, where Renaissance Italy in particular became the forge that sharpened his intellect and ambition, and though the details of his travels remain clouded in uncertainty, later accounts suggest that he first entered the service of mercenaries, perhaps as a common soldier in the French campaigns, and here he would have witnessed both the brutal realities of warfare and the cold calculations of military leadership, experiences that hardened him against fear and taught him that survival was not a matter of noble ideals but of practical choices, loyalty to paymasters, and the ruthless arithmetic of strategy. And it is said that after surviving these years of soldiering he passed into the city-states of Italy, where his fortunes began to transform, for Florence in particular exposed him to a culture unlike anything he had known in England. Florence at the turn of the 16th century was a republic alive with both danger and brilliance, the home of great banking dynasties such as the Medici and a hotbed of political upheaval, where art, commerce, and intrigue mixed in equal measure, and Cromwell, with his quick mind and adaptability, found work in the households of merchants and bankers, learning the mechanics of credit, trade negotiations, and contracts, matters that most Englishmen of his rank could scarcely comprehend, and his ability to learn Italian allowed him to blend into this sophisticated world, eventually becoming fluent enough to negotiate and read legal texts, while absorbing the language of commerce that would later prove invaluable in Henry VIII's court, where England's dealings with the papacy, the German princes, and continental merchants required precisely this kind of cosmopolitan literacy. Accounts even suggest that Cromwell at some stage entered the service of Francesco Frescobaldi, a wealthy Florentine merchant, and in such a household he would have encountered not just banking but also the politics of patronage, the delicate art of balancing favors, credit, and alliances to secure influence, and under Frescobaldi's roof he may have observed how money could flow across Europe to shape wars, topple rulers, or elevate families, an education in the hidden levers of power that English courtiers, often absorbed with land and lineage, rarely understood, and this insight would later make Cromwell unique in his ability to see beyond the local rivalries of England toward the broader economic and diplomatic currents of Europe. Italy also exposed Cromwell to the intellectual ferment of a Renaissance, where humanist scholars revived classical texts, questioned authority, and advocated for education grounded in reason and history rather than rote tradition, and while there is little evidence that Cromwell became a humanist in the scholarly sense, he certainly absorbed the practical lessons of this intellectual climate, valuing literacy, the power of books, and the use of knowledge as a tool for both persuasion and control, which later manifested in his careful management of parliamentary statutes and religious reform tracts that reshaped English society. And perhaps it was in Florence, watching Republicans argue over the legacy of Savonarola or the return of the Medici, that Cromwell first began to see governance as a structure that could be deliberately engineered rather than merely inherited. Another dimension of his Italian sojourn was exposure to the papacy's machinery, for Rome's influence stretched across Italy, and wherever Cromwell traveled he could see firsthand the wealth, power, and corruption associated with the Catholic Church, its indulgences, its taxes, and its sprawling bureaucracy, and though he had not yet risen to the heights of Henry VIII's service, these impressions would remain lodged in his mind, ready to resurface when England's break with Rome presented him with the opportunity to exploit these very weaknesses, for the dissolution of the monasteries and the assertion of royal supremacy over the church later bore the mark of a man who had studied the papal machine and understood both its profits and its vulnerabilities. Cromwell's Italian years also demonstrated his instinct for self-preservation, for while others might have been content to remain servants, he used every chance to expand his skills, moving from soldier to merchant's agent, from interpreter to legal assistant, mastering not only languages but also the mechanics of civil law as practiced in continental courts. And this grounding in Roman and canon law gave him an edge upon his return to England, where the common law system often appeared insular and inflexible, for Cromwell knew how statutes could be written with precision, how contracts could bind men across borders, and how written authority could bend disputes toward desired outcomes, lessons he would deploy to devastating effect when reshaping England's governance under Henry. By the time he returned northward, Cromwell had not only survived but prospered, acquiring a cosmopolitan Polish that few of his countrymen possessed, and when he later described stories of Florence or Antwerp, he would have seemed worldly in the eyes of Londoners still bound by guild traditions and local markets, a man who understood how ships connected to spice routes, how bankers in Florence financed monarchs in Spain, and how letters of credit allowed wars to be waged on scales unimaginable to the medieval world. And this knowledge armed him with a modernity that set him apart from courtiers who still measured worth by heraldry and acres, for Cromwell could see that power in the new age lay not merely in land but in money, law, and information. In sum, Cromwell's Italian years were not an interlude but the crucible in which ambition was fused with opportunity, teaching him lessons of finance, politics, and survival that would later make him invaluable to Henry VIII, and when he finally returned to England, he did so as more than just the son of a blacksmith, returning instead as a man equipped with skills that made him indispensable in a world shifting towards central authority, religious change, and the ruthless competition of European powers. And though his English contemporaries could not yet guess his destiny, Cromwell had already learned that in politics as in commerce one must always calculate, adapt, and strike before others even realize a contest has begun, a philosophy that would carry him to the heart of Tudor government. When Thomas Cromwell returned to England after his transformative years in Europe, he entered a society rigid in hierarchy yet increasingly alive with opportunity for those who could master the crafts of commerce and law, and though his birth barred him from the privileges of noblemen, he had gained in Italy and the Low Countries a set of tools rare among his countrymen, fluency in languages, knowledge of trade, and above all an understanding of how law could be used as both shield and weapon. So he established himself in London as a solicitor, a man who could draw contracts, settle disputes, and represent clients before ecclesiastical and civic courts, and while he never passed through the inns of court in the manner of aristocratic lawyers, he nonetheless gained reputation through practical skill, attracting merchants, guildsmen, and eventually nobles who sought his counsel, because Cromwell was not the sort of lawyer who wasted time on ceremony, but one who knew how to achieve results in a system often hostile to men of low birth. His entry into the legal profession coincided with a London increasingly dominated by trade and the rising power of merchants, and here Cromwell's mercantile background abroad made him especially valuable, for he understood credit, debt, and contracts with a precision that few common lawyers possessed, allowing him to bridge the gap between foreign banking systems and English commercial practices, and in a city where lawsuits over debt, inheritance, and property clogged the courts, Cromwell's reputation for efficiency grew, and he proved adept at maneuvering through overlapping jurisdictions of church law, crown law, and civic charters, often exploiting the ambiguities to secure favorable settlements for his clients, a skill that marked him early as a lawyer who knew how to turn complexity into opportunity. Cromwell's household in Fenchurch Street soon became more than a legal office. It evolved into a hub of activity where clients gathered, apprentices trained, and where his reputation as a man of both competence and discretion deepened, for unlike some lawyers who exploited clients for gain, Cromwell balanced profit with loyalty, earning trust through careful attention to detail. And this network of trust later laid the foundation for his political alliances, because in Tudor England, relationships forged in the city's legal and commercial circles often carried as much weight as aristocratic connections at court, and Cromwell instinctively understood that cultivating dependable allies among merchants and gentry would serve him better than chasing the fickle favor of noble patrons. His skills also extended into parliamentary work, for Cromwell entered the House of Commons in 1523 as a representative for Taunton, where his performance impressed many, not for flamboyant speeches but for his meticulous preparation, his command of detail, and his ability to guide statutes through the labyrinth of parliamentary procedure. And though his role at this stage was modest, he already demonstrated the traits that would later make him indispensable to Henry VIII, namely his capacity to turn the machinery of law into a disciplined instrument of policy. And those who worked with him noted his tireless energy, his encyclopedic memory, and his ability to juggle multiple tasks without losing focus, qualities that in time would terrify his enemies as much as they reassured his allies. Cromwell's legal acumen also gained him work with ecclesiastical cases, where disputes over benefices, clerical appointments, and church property often required subtle negotiation between canon law and royal authority, and here he cultivated a growing skepticism toward ecclesiastical privilege, for he saw firsthand how church courts often abused their power, enriching bishops and abbots at the expense of laymen, and while he did not yet openly challenge the Catholic order, these experiences sharpened his instincts, convincing him that the law must serve the crown above the church, a conviction that later underpinned his role in dismantling papal jurisdiction in England and replacing it with statutes that placed ultimate authority in the hands of Henry VIII. As a lawyer of practical means rather than noble birth, Cromwell developed a style that combined shrewdness with pragmatism, rarely engaging in open conflict unless sure of victory, preferring instead to outmaneuver rivals through careful preparation, mastery of documents, and subtle alliances, and this instinct for survival meant he seldom exposed himself unnecessarily, always retreating when circumstances turned unfavorable, a habit that gave him resilience in a profession where many fell victim to powerful adversaries. And if he sometimes appeared obsequious before superiors, it was calculated rather than cowardly, a performance designed to mask the steely will beneath, because Cromwell understood that in Tudor England survival itself was a victory until opportunities arose to strike decisively. Through his work, Cromwell also began to accumulate wealth, modest at first but steadily increasing, for he invested in property, purchased rents, and expanded his household, ensuring that his family gained stability and that he could project the image of a prosperous and respectable gentleman, and this growing prosperity allowed him to raise his children with advantages he never enjoyed, particularly education, demonstrating that Cromwell never forgot his own humble beginnings and worked tirelessly to ensure his lineage would not be bound by the limitations of his birth, and in doing so he demonstrated the rising fluidity of Tudor society, where law, commerce, and service to the crown could elevate a family from obscurity to prominence within a generation. It was also during this period that Cromwell's Protestant sympathies began to stir, though cautiously, for his continental years had exposed him to reformist ideas circulating through Italy and the Low Countries, and back in England he found himself drawn to humanist circles where the corruption of the clergy was openly discussed, and while he did not yet commit to the radicalism that would later define his role in the Reformation, his legal dealings with church property and his experience of ecclesiastical injustice inclined him toward reform, and he quietly aligned with thinkers who saw the law as an instrument for curbing clerical excess and strengthening royal authority, beliefs that prepared him for the seismic shifts soon to come. By the late 1520s, Cromwell had established himself as a seasoned lawyer, parliamentarian, and trusted agent for many influential figures, and though still far from the centers of royal power, he had carved a niche as a man who could be relied upon to solve problems that others deemed intractable, and this reputation soon brought him to the attention of the most powerful churchman in England, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who saw in Cromwell not merely another legal assistant, but a man of remarkable capability, tireless energy, and utter pragmatism, qualities that Wolsey knew he could use in the complex and often perilous business of serving the king, and thus Cromwell's journey from blacksmith's son to soldier, merchant, lawyer, and now servant of the greatest statesman in England set him firmly upon the path toward the heart of Tudor politics, where his survival skills would be tested as never before. When Thomas Cromwell entered the service of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in the late 1520s, he stepped into the very engine room of power in Tudor England, for Wolsey, son of an Ipswich butcher who had risen to become Archbishop of York, papal legate, and Lord Chancellor, dominated the political landscape with unmatched authority, and Cromwell, whose own background mirrored Wolsey's ascent from obscurity, found in the cardinal both a model and a master, joining his household first as a legal advisor and parliamentary manager, roles that allowed him to display the skills he had sharpened in London and on the continent, and within Wolsey's vast administrative network Cromwell quickly distinguished himself by his ability to draft precise statutes, organize finances, and conduct delicate negotiations, earning a reputation as a man who could bring order to chaos, which made him indispensable to a master burdened with the impossible task of balancing Henry VIII's ambitions with the realities of European diplomacy. Wolsey's household was not merely a domestic establishment but a miniature court in itself, housing hundreds of clerks, servants, chaplains, and lawyers, and within this labyrinth Cromwell rose from relative obscurity to prominence, working tirelessly to manage the cardinal's affairs, and here he refined his skills in navigating the currents of patronage, cultivating alliances with Wolsey's clients and dependents, while carefully avoiding conflict with rivals, for he knew that Wolsey's fall would mean ruin for all who depended on him, and so Cromwell learned to balance loyalty with foresight, never overexposing himself, yet always demonstrating such competence that Wolsey could not afford to let him go, a delicate strategy that kept him safe when the cardinal's enemies at court sharpened their knives. Cromwell's most visible contribution during these years was his work in Parliament, particularly the 1523 session where Wolsey sought heavy taxation to fund Henry's wars in France, a deeply unpopular measure that required skilled management, and here Cromwell demonstrated his ability to control debate, frame arguments, and shepherd legislation through hostile chambers. Skills that impressed both Wolsey and observers who noted how a man of humble origins could dominate proceedings without ostentation, using detail, persuasion, and persistence rather than noble swagger, and these qualities soon marked him as a new kind of political operator, one who wielded power through paperwork, statutes, and careful orchestration rather than family lineage or battlefield glory. In Wolsey's service, Cromwell also became deeply involved in ecclesiastical affairs, assisting with the foundation of colleges, the administration of church revenues, and the suppression of minor religious houses to fund educational institutions, and these projects offered him first-hand experience in dismantling monastic establishments and redistributing wealth. A rehearsal of sorts for the far larger dissolution he would later oversee under Henry, and through these early ventures he honed the ability to manage property seizures, negotiate with reluctant clergy, and enforce reforms with legal precision, all the while concealing his personal views behind the mantle of service to his master, a discretion that ensured his survival when critics of Wolsey began targeting his household as symbols of clerical greed. Wolsey's greatness, however, was also his vulnerability, for his accumulation of offices and his unrivaled power provoked jealousy among the nobility and resentment from a king who increasingly saw his servant as an obstacle rather than a partner, and Cromwell, always alert to shifts in fortune, observed with keen eyes how fragile even the mightiest positions could be, and when Wolsey failed to secure Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, the cardinal's enemies seized their chance, orchestrating his downfall in 1529, an event that sent shockwaves through his vast household, leaving many ruined and desperate. Yet Cromwell, displaying the survival instinct that defined his career, maneuvered through the wreckage with skill, protecting his interests while demonstrating loyalty to his disgraced master even as he began quietly to position himself for service directly under the king. The fall of Wolsey was a defining test for Cromwell, who risked being swept away in the same tide that destroyed his patron, yet his response revealed the qualities that would later make him Henry VIII's most formidable minister, for instead of abandoning Wolsey outright, he stood by him in his final months, defending his legacy in Parliament and ensuring his affairs were wound down with dignity, a loyalty that impressed even the king, who valued steadfastness in the midst of treachery. And at the same time, Cromwell began cultivating his own reputation as a man of unmatched administrative talent, gradually detaching his fortunes from Wolsey's collapse without ever appearing opportunistic, a balancing act that preserved both his integrity and his prospects. During this transition, Cromwell's personal faith and political instincts also came into sharper focus, for in defending Wolsey he confronted the growing faction of nobles and churchmen who sought to reduce clerical influence and seize wealth for themselves, and while Cromwell remained outwardly cautious, he showed a willingness to embrace reformist ideas that aligned with Henry's needs, particularly the notion that the crown should command supremacy over both church and state, and these sympathies would soon set him apart as the ideal instrument for a monarch determined to rid himself of papal control, proving that Cromwell's years with Wolsey were not wasted but rather an apprenticeship in both the uses and the perils of concentrated power. By the time Wolsey died in 1530 on his way to answer charges of treason, Cromwell had already secured a new trajectory, for his loyalty during the crisis had won Henry's attention, and his proven ability to manage law, Parliament, and finance marked him as the perfect candidate to fill the vacuum left by Wolsey's fall, and though many in court sneered at his low birth and resented his rise, Cromwell understood better than most that service, not ancestry, determined survival under a king as volatile as Henry, and thus the blacksmith's son who had once fought as a mercenary and studied commerce in Florence now prepared to step into the highest arena of power, armed with lessons learned in Wolsey's orbit, lessons of ambition, loyalty, and above all the ruthless necessity of adaptation. The downfall of Cardinal Wolsey in 1529 was one of the most dramatic reversals in Tudor politics, and for Thomas Cromwell it represented both a profound crisis and a singular opportunity, for his master, once the most powerful man in England next to the king himself, was cast down in disgrace after failing to secure Henry VIII's much-desired annulment from Catherine of Aragon. And though Wolsey's enemies rejoiced at his ruin, those within his household faced ruin themselves, yet Cromwell, ever the strategist, not only survived the collapse but emerged stronger, using his loyalty, his legal skill, and his political acumen to turn the moment of peril into the launch of his extraordinary career at the very heart of royal government, proving once again that he was a man who could transform adversity into advantage. Wolsey's failure in the matter of the king's divorce was the product of forces beyond even his considerable control, for Henry's demand to end his marriage to Catherine, who had borne him no male heir, collided with the papacy's political entanglements, especially the dominance of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and nephew of Catherine, over Pope Clement VII, making papal approval impossible without offending one of Europe's most powerful rulers. And when Wolsey could not deliver the annulment, Henry's frustration turned to anger, and the cardinal's enemies, long resentful of his arrogance and power, pounced, stripping him of offices and humiliating him publicly, a fate that might easily have engulfed Cromwell, who was deeply associated with Wolsey's administration. Cromwell, however, showed remarkable resilience, for rather than abandoning his disgraced master, he continued to serve him faithfully during his final year, managing his affairs, defending his policies, and attempting to salvage what remained of his projects. And this steadfastness, unusual in a world where most abandoned fallen patrons, impressed observers, even Henry himself, who admired loyalty as much as he despised failure. And Cromwell further distinguished himself by taking a bold role in Parliament during 1529, the so-called Reformation Parliament, where he argued with eloquence and tenacity in defense of Wolsey, demonstrating both courage and ability in a chamber dominated by the king's reformist agenda. And this performance won him recognition from men who now saw in Cromwell not just Wolsey's servant but a rising force in his own right. The Reformation Parliament was Cromwell's stage to showcase his mastery of statute and procedure, for as members debated grievances against the Church, abuses of clerical courts, and the limits of papal authority, he positioned himself not as a radical but as a practical reformer, willing to address abuses through precise legislation rather than reckless denunciation. And in this role he caught the king's eye, for Henry needed men who could turn his personal desires into legal reality, and Cromwell's ability to draft laws, marshal arguments, and bend complex systems to new purposes made him invaluable at a moment when the old order was beginning to crack. And thus, while Wolsey's fall was the end of one era, it marked the beginning of Cromwell's ascent as the man who could deliver what Wolsey could not. Wolsey's death in 1530, on his way to London under charges of treason, severed the last tie to Cromwell's old life and freed him to attach himself directly to the king. And though the death of his master was a personal blow, it was also a political liberation, allowing Cromwell to present himself not as Wolsey's dependent but as a servant ready to dedicate all his talents to Henry. And in doing so he stepped into the vacuum left by the cardinal, offering the monarch a new kind of minister, one unencumbered by clerical office, unburdened by noble ties, and focused solely on advancing the royal will through law, statute, and parliament, an approach that contrasted sharply with Wolsey's reliance on papal authority and personal diplomacy. Cromwell's rise in the aftermath of Wolsey's fall was not inevitable, for he faced fierce opposition from nobles who despised his low birth and resented the intrusion of new men into the corridors of power. But his unmatched industry and adaptability won him allies where it mattered most, first among reform-minded clerics who sought to diminish papal influence, and then within the king's inner circle, where his loyalty, discretion, and talent for problem-solving quickly made him indispensable. And Henry, ever suspicious of great lords who might challenge his authority, found in Cromwell the perfect servant, ambitious yet dependent, brilliant yet humble in his presence, and above all ruthless in executing the royal will. One of Cromwell's first tasks under the king was to continue advancing the case for the annulment through legal and parliamentary means, shifting the focus away from papal approval toward the assertion that the king himself, through God's law and parliament's authority, could determine the validity of his marriage. And this argument, radical in its implications, laid the foundation for England's break with Rome, and Cromwell's role in crafting the statutes that would give Henry the supremacy he craved was central, for he knew how to dress revolutionary ideas in the sober language of legal precedent, making them palatable to a nation wary of open rebellion against the Church, a skill that would soon elevate him to the king's chief architect of reform. As Cromwell settled into royal service, his personal qualities also set him apart, for he combined diligence with pragmatism, working long hours drafting documents, interrogating witnesses, and preparing bills, often laboring where others shirked, and his persistence ensured that Henry's policies did not remain vague wishes but became enforceable law, and contemporaries marveled at his memory and capacity for detail, noting that he could recite complex chains of events or statutes without reference to papers, a gift that made him formidable in debate and negotiations, and in a court where many relied on lineage and charm, Cromwell's arsenal of sheer competence proved far more useful to a king obsessed with control. Thus, the fall of Wolsey, which at first threatened to drag Cromwell into oblivion, instead became the crucible in which his career was reborn, marking the transition from loyal servant of a disgraced cardinal to indispensable counselor of the king himself, and by the early 1530s Cromwell was already emerging as the mastermind of Henry's legislative revolution, prepared to dismantle centuries of papal authority and restructure England's relationship to church and crown, and in this transformation lay the essence of Cromwell's genius, the ability to survive catastrophe by turning it into opportunity, proving that the blacksmith's son from Putney was not merely a survivor of fortune but its deliberate architect. When Thomas Cromwell entered Henry VIII's direct service in the early 1530s, he was still one of many talented figures hovering at the edge of royal favor, but unlike courtiers who relied on charm, lineage, or proximity, Cromwell secured the king's trust through sheer efficiency, unwavering loyalty, and an uncanny ability to transform Henry's turbulent desires into workable policy, for the king, though powerful, was impulsive and easily frustrated, and he needed a minister who could both understand his aims and translate them into tangible results, and in Cromwell he found a man who asked no questions of conscience, no questions of morality, only the practical question of how the royal will could be achieved. The first and most pressing issue was Henry's determination to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a matter that had paralyzed England's politics for years and destroyed Wolsey's career, and Cromwell approached it not as a problem of theology or papal diplomacy but as one of sovereignty, arguing that Parliament, guided by the king, had the authority to legislate in matters of marriage and succession, thereby bypassing Rome altogether. And this shift in approach, bold and legally ingenious, resonated with Henry, who had grown weary of waiting on papal decisions that never came, and Cromwell's proposals gave him a new path forward, one that promised both resolution of his personal dilemma and an expansion of his power. Henry was cautious at first, for to declare independence from Rome was no small matter, but Cromwell carefully framed the argument in terms of restoring ancient rights rather than creating dangerous novelties, pointing to statutes that had once limited papal influence in England, invoking precedents of kings who had resisted foreign interference, and by presenting reform as continuity rather than rebellion, he calmed Henry's anxieties and convinced him that what he sought was not revolution but restoration, and Henry, flattered by the notion that he was reviving ancient sovereignty, embraced Cromwell's plan with growing enthusiasm, making the lawyer from Putney his indispensable counselor in the matter closest to his heart. Cromwell's methods also appealed to Henry's personality, for where Wolsey had sometimes appeared to manipulate or restrain the king, Cromwell acted always as an enabler, presenting obstacles only to offer solutions, never resisting but reshaping Henry's demands into viable strategies, and this gave the monarch a sense of mastery, as though his own brilliance were being enacted by law, when in fact it was Cromwell who carefully designed the structures, and the king, proud and suspicious, came to value this subtle loyalty above all, trusting Cromwell to carry out his will without fear or hesitation, an impression strengthened by the minister's relentless work ethic and his refusal to enrich himself ostentatiously in the manner of Wolsey. At the same time, Cromwell recognized that securing Henry's confidence required more than drafting statutes. It required creating an administrative machine that functioned smoothly, so he set about reorganizing royal finances, auditing revenues, and tightening the machinery of governance, ensuring that the crown's new powers over the church and its lands would flow into the king's coffers, and Henry, who had always worried about money, especially after his costly wars in France, was delighted to see his resources grow, associating this prosperity with Cromwell's management, and thus the minister's role expanded from divorce strategist to general overseer of royal administration, a position from which he could shape nearly every facet of policy. Cromwell also understood the value of information in a court rife with intrigue, so he cultivated networks of informants, secretaries, and agents who kept him apprised of developments both in Parliament and among the nobility, and by relaying this intelligence to the king in careful doses, he enhanced his reputation as the man who always knew the truth, while also steering Henry's perceptions in directions favorable to his own plans, and this subtle influence, exercised behind closed doors and in the drafting rooms of Whitehall, gave Cromwell a power greater than many nobles with swords and titles, for he could shape the king's opinions at their source, ensuring that his own vision became indistinguishable from the monarch's will. Perhaps most critical of all was Cromwell's ability to balance ruthlessness with restraint, for he knew when to strike hard against opponents and when to recommend patience, and Henry, a man prone to violent impulses, relied on his minister to judge the proper moment for action, and when figures like Thomas More resisted the supremacy or Bishop John Fisher opposed the annulment, it was Cromwell who orchestrated the legal maneuvers that led to their downfall, presenting the outcomes as inevitable consequences of disloyalty rather than personal vendettas, and thus Henry was shielded from charges of tyranny while still enjoying the removal of obstacles, reinforcing his faith that Cromwell was both his protector and his executioner in one. The consolidation of Henry's trust was also visible in the honors Cromwell gradually received, for he entered the King's Council, became Master of the Rolls, and later was made Principal Secretary, a position that placed him at the very heart of government, controlling the flow of royal correspondence and petitions, and through this office he gained unprecedented access to the King's thoughts, shaping them even as he recorded them, a privilege that made him the gatekeeper to Henry's will and elevated him above courtiers of far older lineage, a transformation so rapid and extraordinary that it shocked contemporaries but seemed natural to a king who valued results above pedigree. By the mid-1530s, Cromwell had become more than just a servant. He was Henry's instrument of transformation, the man who could turn dreams into decrees, fears into prosecutions, and desires into statutes, and in this role he secured not only the king's confidence but his reliance, for Henry, who never tolerated rivals and who discarded favorites easily, held on to Cromwell for more than a decade, a testament to the extraordinary bond forged in these early years when the lawyer from Putney proved himself indispensable in the matter of the annulment and in the broader project of remaking England's governance, setting the stage for triumphs and tragedies alike. The greatest achievement of Thomas Cromwell's career, and the act that would secure his place in history as both visionary and villain, was his orchestration of England's break with the papacy, for though Henry VIII's desire for an annulment had sparked the crisis, it was Cromwell who gave the king's personal problem the structure of a political revolution, carefully drafting legislation, managing parliament, and reshaping the nation's institutions so that Henry could declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, a transformation that redefined the relationship between crown, church, and people in ways that would echo for centuries, and all of it achieved not through sweeping speeches or martial force, but through the steady, meticulous labor of a lawyer who understood that words written into statute could be sharper than any sword. The first step was the Statute in Restraint of Appeals of 1533, which declared that final authority in ecclesiastical matters rested with the king and his courts rather than the pope, effectively cutting off English subjects from appealing to Rome, and though its language invoked ancient customs and national independence, the real effect was revolutionary, for it severed the spiritual and legal bond that had bound England to the papal court for generations, and Cromwell, who had drafted the measure, defended it as a natural assertion of sovereignty, arguing that England was an empire governed by one supreme head, the king, and that no foreign potentate had jurisdiction over its subjects, a doctrine that provided Henry the legal foundation to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon by his own authority and wed in Berlin without papal sanction. The annulment and remarriage of 1533, crowned by Anne's coronation as queen, demonstrated the effectiveness of Cromwell's approach, for Henry had at last achieved what Wolsey could not, and the legitimacy of the process rested not on papal indulgence but on parliamentary statute, binding the king's will into the fabric of English law, and Cromwell had ensured that the break, once made, could not be easily undone, for appeals to tradition, loyalty to Rome, or objections of conscience now had no legal standing, and those who resisted the new order, from Thomas More to John Fisher, found themselves prosecuted not as men of principle but as traitors to the realm, victims of statutes designed with surgical precision by Cromwell's pen. The culmination of this transformation came with the Act of Supremacy in 1534, a law that formally recognized Henry as the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, a title that elevated the king above all bishops and clerics, replacing the Pope's spiritual jurisdiction with royal supremacy, and Cromwell, who had been instrumental in drafting and pushing the measure through Parliament, was rewarded with the unprecedented title of vicegerent in spirituals, making him the king's deputy in all church matters, a role that gave him more authority over religious affairs than any bishop and effectively placed him at the helm of the English Reformation, though his aim was not theology but power, for Cromwell remained less concerned with doctrine than with ensuring that the king's authority faced no rival. Cromwell's skill in this process lay not only in legislation but in managing Parliament, for he understood the delicate balance of pressure and persuasion needed to secure compliance, arranging elections that brought in sympathetic members, intimidating opposition with charges of disloyalty, and framing debates in such a way that resistance seemed futile. And while Henry occasionally appeared in Parliament to assert his majesty, it was Cromwell who orchestrated the sessions, guiding committees, drafting bills, and ensuring the king's demands were clothed in the legitimacy of statute, and contemporaries remarked with awe and fear at how this man of humble birth could bend the nation's legislative body to his will, a feat that gave him unmatched influence over the kingdom's direction. Yet Cromwell was not content with merely severing ties with Rome. He also moved swiftly to consolidate the consequences of that break, overseeing the drafting of the Treasons Act of 1534, which made it a capital crime to deny the king's supremacy, and the oath of supremacy, which required subjects to swear allegiance to the new order. Measures that turned dissent into treason and placed thousands of Englishmen in peril if they resisted, and through these statutes Cromwell created a climate of fear that ensured compliance, even as martyrs shed blood for conscience, and while Henry's name adorned the laws, it was Cromwell's hand that gave them shape, revealing the ruthless edge behind his legal ingenuity. Cromwell also used his new authority to tighten royal control over the clergy, issuing injunctions that regulated sermons, supervised the printing of Bibles and devotional works, and demanded the suppression of superstition and corruption, though he remained cautious not to push doctrinal reforms too quickly, aware that Henry himself was conservative in faith, but by embedding royal supremacy into every level of religious life, from parish churches to monasteries, Cromwell laid the groundwork for future reformers to advance Protestant ideas under the protection of the crown, ensuring that the king's personal divorce became the opening chapter of a far larger religious revolution. The political consequences of the break were profound, for by casting off papal authority Henry made himself the arbiter of spiritual as well as temporal power, a concentration of authority unprecedented in English history, and Cromwell, as the architect of this transformation, became indispensable to the king. The man who had delivered the solution to his marital crisis and simultaneously elevated his majesty to heights no English monarch had ever claimed, and Henry's gratitude was evident in the trust he placed in Cromwell, relying on him to enforce, expand, and defend the supremacy, while courtiers and nobles, many of whom despised the minister, recognized that he now stood at the center of power, wielding influence greater even than Wolsey in his pomp. Thus, by the mid-1530s, Cromwell had completed the most audacious legal and political project of the Tudor age, turning Henry's frustrated desire for an annulment into the foundation of a national church, and in doing so he secured his master's confidence, elevated himself to unprecedented authority, and altered forever the trajectory of England. And while the seeds of resistance, rebellion, and reformation were already germinating, Cromwell's achievement was undeniable, for he had demonstrated how a single mind, armed with law and determination, could break with centuries of tradition and remake the kingdom in the image of its king, a feat that would make him both indispensable and, in time, dangerously vulnerable. The dissolution of the monasteries was Thomas Cromwell's boldest and most destructive project, an undertaking that reshaped England's religious, social, and economic landscape beyond recognition. For once Henry VIII had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, the great monastic institutions that had for centuries served as centers of prayer, learning, charity, and wealth stood exposed to royal authority. And it was Cromwell, acting as the king's vicegerent, who devised the machinery to investigate, suppress, and seize their vast resources, transforming sacred houses into treasure troves for the crown, dismantling a centuries-old network of spirituality and community, and unleashing consequences that would reverberate through English life for generations. Cromwell began cautiously with a visitation in 1535, sending royal commissioners to survey the monasteries, ostensibly to inspect their spiritual health and moral discipline, but in reality to compile evidence of corruption, idleness, and vice that could justify their dissolution, and the resulting Vela Ecclesiasticus a massive survey of ecclesiastical wealth, revealed the staggering resources under monastic control, ranging from fertile lands to gold and silver plate, some so vast that they rivaled the king's own revenues, and Cromwell, ever practical, recognized that appropriating this wealth would not only enrich the crown but bind Henry's nobility to the new order, for the distribution of confiscated lands would create a class of gentry loyal to the Reformation settlement because their fortunes depended on it. The first phase targeted smaller houses, with the Act of 1536 dissolving monasteries worth less than £200 a year, justified publicly as a measure against institutions deemed manifestly full of vice and superstitious, but privately intended to test resistance and prepare the way for greater seizures, and Cromwell oversaw the process with relentless efficiency, dispatching commissioners to close houses, expel monks and nuns, and transfer properties to the crown, often facing bitter resistance from local communities who had relied on the monasteries for charity, employment, and spiritual guidance. Yet Cromwell pressed forward, presenting each suppression as a moral reform while ensuring that the profits poured into Henry's treasury. The closures provoked unrest, most famously in the Pilgrimage of Grace of 1536, a massive rebellion in northern England fueled by anger over the attack on the church and fear of further religious changes, and though the uprising was suppressed with brutal force, it revealed the deep attachment ordinary people felt to their monasteries, whose libraries, hospitals, and alms had formed the fabric of daily life. Yet Cromwell treated the rebellion as proof of the necessity of his work, arguing that the monasteries bred sedition by giving shelter to conservative clergy, and the revolt only hardened his determination to eradicate them entirely, framing dissolution as not only a financial and religious measure but a safeguard for political order. By 1539, Cromwell moved to complete the destruction with the Second Act of Dissolution, which authorized the suppression of all remaining monasteries, regardless of wealth or reputation, and commissioners swept across the kingdom, compelling abbots to surrender their houses, seizing lands, and stripping buildings of their treasures, and while some abbots negotiated pensions, others resisted and faced execution. Their once sacred houses reduced to ruins or converted into private estates for Henry's supporters, and within a few years nearly 800 religious houses vanished, their lands redistributed, their relics destroyed, and their communities scattered, a cultural earthquake that Cromwell directed with merciless determination. The consequences of the dissolution were immense, for the crown gained unprecedented wealth, though Henry's extravagance and foreign policy soon dissipated much of it, and the redistribution of lands created a new Protestant-leaning gentry class eager to defend their acquisitions. Yet the loss of monastic charity left a vacuum in poor relief, forcing later governments to devise new systems to care for the needy, while libraries filled with priceless manuscripts were burned or dispersed, representing a cultural devastation alongside the economic transformation. And though Cromwell justified his work as reform and renewal, contemporaries lamented the destruction of centuries of devotion, accusing him of sacrilege and greed. Cromwell himself profited less than many nobles, for though he acquired some lands and enriched his household, his true reward lay in power, for the dissolution cemented his status as the architect of Henry's Reformation, the man who had both financed the crown and broken the institutional backbone of resistance to royal supremacy. And his mastery of administration in directing such a vast undertaking confirmed his reputation as the king's indispensable minister, even as it made him feared and hated across much of the realm. For while Henry reaped the wealth, it was Cromwell who bore the blame for the destruction of monasteries loved by the people and revered by tradition. By the early 1540s, the landscape of England had been irrevocably altered, with abbeys reduced to ruins, their stones carted off for secular buildings, their lands turned into private estates, and their communities dissolved. And though the political and economic logic of the dissolution ensured its permanence, the memory of what had been lost endured in cultural and religious consciousness, making Cromwell both a figure of awe and infamy, praised by reformers as the man who liberated England from superstition but cursed by traditionalists as the destroyer of holy places, and in orchestrating this monumental transformation, Cromwell reached the zenith of his influence, standing as the architect of a new England even as the seeds of his own downfall were being sown. By the late 1530s, Thomas Cromwell had become not only the executor of Henry VIII's will but the architect of a new style of government, transforming medieval kingship into a modern bureaucracy, for where Wolsey had relied on personal influence and papal authority, Cromwell constructed an administrative system grounded in statute, precedent, and paperwork, building new courts, streamlining finance, and ensuring that royal authority reached further and more efficiently than ever before, and in doing so he fashioned a state apparatus that could survive beyond the whims of its monarch, a system so robust that historians would later speak of a Tudor revolution in government, crediting Cromwell with laying the foundations of centralized power in England. One of Cromwell's chief innovations was the creation of specialized financial courts to handle the flood of wealth from the dissolution of the monasteries, such as the Court of Augmentations, which managed former monastic lands and revenues, and the Court of First Fruits and Tenths, which collected clerical taxes previously paid to Rome, and by dividing functions into distinct institutions with clear bureaucratic procedures, he replaced the older, looser methods of the exchequer with a more precise and accountable system, one that allowed the crown to monitor income and expenditure with greater accuracy, and though Henry himself had little patience for account books, he relished the steady flow of funds, praising Cromwell as the man who filled his coffers and curbed corruption. Cromwell also redefined the role of Parliament, which had once been summoned irregularly to grant taxation or confirm royal decrees but now became the engine of Henry's Reformation, passing acts that reshaped religion, succession, and governance, and this reliance on parliamentary statute gave legitimacy to royal policies while also embedding them into the law of the realm, making them harder to overturn. And though Henry remained the source of authority, Cromwell's manipulation of Parliament ensured that his wishes were expressed through the consent of the political nation, a subtle but lasting shift that elevated the role of statute over proclamation, giving English governance a more legalistic and institutional character. Equally important was Cromwell's attention to administration at the local level, for he extended the Crown's oversight into shires and towns, strengthening the role of royal commissioners, justices of the peace, and local officials who enforced the new religious settlement, collected taxes, and reported on signs of sedition, and by tying local governance more closely to central authority, he reduced the autonomy of regional magnates who had once exercised semi-independent power, binding the kingdom more tightly under the Crown. And this centralization, though resented by nobles, gave Henry greater control over his subjects than any of his predecessors, a control that owed much to Cromwell's tireless attention to detail and insistence on accountability. Cromwell's statecraft was not limited to finance and law but extended into propaganda and information control, for he recognized that royal supremacy needed to be defended not only in statutes but in the minds of the people, so he oversaw the circulation of sermons, injunctions, and printed materials that promoted obedience to the king and denounced papal authority, while simultaneously suppressing dissent through censorship and the prosecution of heretical or seditious texts. And though he was personally sympathetic to reformist ideas, his policy was less about theology than about discipline, ensuring that the king's image as supreme head was consistently reinforced across pulpits, print shops, and public proclamations. His mastery of statecraft also lay in his ability to manage factions at court, balancing the interests of reformers who sought deeper Protestant changes with conservatives loyal to traditional practices, and while Henry's own religious views remained cautious, Cromwell navigated the competing pressures by advancing reform incrementally where possible while preserving the king's conservative sensibilities, using his position to shield reformist allies when convenient and sacrifice them when necessary. And in this balancing act he demonstrated a cold pragmatism that kept him in favor with Henry while maintaining a network of supporters among the rising evangelical gentry who owed their fortunes to the dissolution. Cromwell's reach extended into foreign affairs as well, where he used diplomacy not simply as negotiation between princes but as a tool of statecraft that complemented his domestic reforms, promoting alliances that secured England's independence from Rome and seeking ties with Protestant powers like the German princes, though Henry's vacillations often frustrated these efforts. Yet even in diplomacy Cromwell's skill lay in using correspondence, envoys, and treaties to bolster the king's authority rather than his own glory, reflecting his role as the ultimate servant minister who wielded immense power without ever appearing to rival the crown. What set Cromwell apart as a statesman was his insistence on systems over personalities, for where others at court rose and fell with royal favor, he built institutions that endured, embedding royal supremacy into legal structures, administrative courts, and parliamentary statutes that could function without his direct oversight. And in this sense his true legacy was not merely the favor he enjoyed from Henry but the machinery of governance he left behind, a machinery that would continue to shape England long after his head had fallen. And though contemporaries saw him as a ruthless enforcer, historians would later see him as a visionary, the craftsman of a state capable of sustaining both Tudor majesty and national independence. By the height of his career, Cromwell had transformed England into a realm more centralized, wealthier, and legally bound to its monarch than ever before, and though his enemies whispered that he was a tyrant in the making, his genius lay in his ability to mask personal ambition beneath the guise of royal service, presenting every innovation, every statute, every court as the king's will executed faithfully. And so long as Henry believed in that service, Cromwell stood unassailable, the master of statecraft who had turned the king's turbulent passions into the framework of a new order, though the very system he built would one day fail to protect him when the currents of favor turned. As the 1530s advanced, Thomas Cromwell perfected the machinery of royal government in ways that not only strengthened Henry VIII's authority but also reshaped the balance of power within the realm, and while earlier councillors had sought to serve the king by moderating his impulses, Cromwell approached governance as an engineer, building systems that magnified the monarch's will and bound subjects more tightly to the crown, which meant that instead of acting merely as a secretary shuffling papers, he reorganized the council, streamlined royal finance, and placed his men in offices across England so that nothing escaped his attention, and one of his most lasting innovations was the development of specialized departments such as the Court of Augmentations, created to handle the vast wealth seized from monasteries, ensuring that land, plate, and rents once directed to religious houses now flowed into the king's coffers with unprecedented efficiency, and though such bureaucratic reshaping may appear dry, it was revolutionary in practice, for it marked the transformation of England from a realm ruled through feudal networks and personal bonds to one increasingly managed through paperwork, account books, and professional clerks loyal to the crown rather than to noble patrons. The impact of Cromwell's administrative vision reached deep into the localities, where sheriffs, justices of the peace, and commissioners received instructions drafted in his clear and forceful style, turning royal orders into practical commands that could be neither ignored nor easily subverted, and while past kings had relied on magnates to enforce policy, Cromwell diminished their independence by inserting crown-appointed officers and demanding written reports, thereby creating lines of accountability that ran not to the great lords but to Westminster itself, a shift that bred resentment among the aristocracy, who felt their traditional autonomy undermined by a man they considered a jumped-up blacksmith's son. Yet for commoners and middling folk the picture was mixed, for some benefited from opportunities to serve in new administrative posts or to purchase monastic lands at advantageous rates, while others chafed under the increasing surveillance and taxation made possible by Cromwell's apparatus, and in both praise and blame his name became synonymous with the new order of governance. Integral to this machinery was Cromwell's understanding of information, for he cultivated a network of informants, correspondents, and clerks who kept him supplied with intelligence about happenings across the kingdom, and whether it was rumors of disloyalty in the north, disputes over land transfers, or whispers of papist sympathies among clerics, Cromwell demanded reports and acted swiftly, using Parliament and royal proclamations to codify responses into law, which in turn reinforced the sense that he was not only executing Henry's will but also shaping policy proactively, for Parliament under his guidance ceased to be a sporadic gathering of estates and became instead a regular instrument of government, producing statutes that embedded the break with Rome, defined treason expansively, and legitimized the redistribution of church wealth. And though contemporaries muttered that Cromwell manipulated Parliament, the truth was subtler, for he gave members a sense of participation in a national project, thereby binding them to the new religious and political settlement even when misgivings lingered. The Cromwellian machine also extended into diplomacy, where he coordinated envoys, cultivated foreign merchants, and managed correspondence with ambassadors, blending secrecy and openness in ways that kept Henry informed yet maintained flexibility. And though he could not control the shifting tides of European politics, he ensured that England's position was clearly articulated and defended, often by appealing not merely to dynastic claims but to the newly emphasized notion of sovereign independence from papal authority, a legal argument that dovetailed with his broader project of embedding royal supremacy in every facet of governance, and his training as a lawyer and merchant allowed him to treat diplomacy not just as a matter of aristocratic courtesy but as negotiation over law, treaties, and trade privileges, which in turn reflected his broader habit of translating abstract power into concrete mechanisms, whether in foreign courts or domestic councils, all feeding back into the central aim of bolstering Henry's sovereignty. Yet for all its successes, Cromwell's system engendered hostility that simmered beneath the surface, for nobles resented being checked by bureaucrats, clerics mourned the erosion of their authority, and even some commoners felt alienated by the speed of religious change and the intrusion of officials into village life. And while Cromwell worked tirelessly to maintain order, rebellions such as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 demonstrated the limits of administrative control, revealing that, though paper and proclamations could extend royal authority, they could not eradicate deeply held loyalties overnight, forcing Cromwell to adapt by coupling administrative force with displays of royal clemency and negotiation, proving again his talent for survival. but also hinting at the fragility of the edifice he had built. For in centralizing so much authority he made himself indispensable and at the same time dangerously exposed, and though he had turned Henry VIII's government into a machine of unprecedented reach, he also ensured that the machine bore his fingerprints at every stage, leaving little doubt among friend and foe alike that this New England was Cromwell's creation as much as the king's. If Thomas Cromwell's machinery of government transformed England's administration, his interventions in religion were even more dramatic, for in the space of a decade he helped redefine the spiritual fabric of the nation, dismantling centuries of Catholic authority and weaving in its place a new order centered upon the supremacy of the crown. And while Henry VIII himself desired an annulment and a freer hand in ecclesiastical matters, it was Cromwell who translated those impulses into policies that reached parish altars, cloisters, and even the daily prayers of ordinary people, beginning with the assertion of royal supremacy over the Church in England, which Cromwell advanced not only through statutes but also through relentless visitation campaigns, where commissioners entered monasteries, cathedrals, and colleges to assess loyalty, confiscate relics, and enforce the king's authority, all recorded meticulously so that Westminster could monitor the faith of its subjects. In practice, Cromwell's role as vicegerent in spirituals gave him unparalleled power, effectively making him the king's deputy in ecclesiastical governance, and he wielded this authority with a blend of legal logic and ruthless determination, ordering that sermons be licensed, that pulpits echo the message of royal supremacy, and that English Bibles be placed in churches, so that subjects might no longer rely solely on priests but could themselves encounter the scriptures in their own tongue, a move that both empowered lay devotion and unsettled clerical control. For while some welcomed access to sacred texts, others feared that untrained readers would wander into heresy, and it was Cromwell who balanced these tensions, prosecuting radical preachers when their zeal threatened social order while still pushing forward a reorientation of worship towards simpler, scripture-based practice. One of his most decisive campaigns was the dissolution of monasteries, for beyond their religious significance these houses controlled immense wealth, land, and local influence, and Cromwell understood that stripping them of power would both enrich the crown and weaken potential opposition, so he dispatched commissioners to inventory their assets, expose moral failings, and recommend closures, and though propaganda emphasized corruption, the deeper truth was that even well-run houses could not survive the sweep of policy, leading to the sale of lands to nobles and gentry, which in turn redistributed wealth in a way that bound influential families to the new order, while monks and nuns were pensioned off or cast adrift, and communities that had long relied on monastic charity suddenly found hospitals shuttered and alms curtailed, producing social dislocation that critics laid at Cromwell's feet, branding him destroyer of the old faith. Yet Cromwell did not simply strip away. He also sought to instruct, commissioning the production of the Great Bible, encouraging the spread of homilies that emphasized obedience to king and law, and regulating church festivals to curb excess, thereby shaping not only institutional structures but also the rhythms of worship, and his policies reflected a practical theology in which loyalty to the crown was the surest marker of orthodoxy, so that dissent became not merely a matter of doctrine but of treason, a conflation that granted him extraordinary leverage against opponents, and while Henry's personal conservatism meant that certain Catholic practices remained intact, Cromwell's pressure kept nudging England toward reform patterns, planting seeds that would blossom more fully in later reigns, though at the time the blending of old and new left many confused, fearful, or quietly resistant. Opposition inevitably gathered, from conservative bishops who balked at changes to rebels in the north who raised banners for the old religion, and in each case Cromwell responded with a mixture of conciliation and force, drafting proclamations that promised to preserve essential truths of the faith while simultaneously prosecuting dissenters with unrelenting severity, and this dual strategy revealed his gift for political survival, but also deepened resentment, for to his enemies he appeared a hypocrite who cloaked ambition in piety, while to his allies he seemed at times too willing to compromise for the sake of order. Yet either way his centrality to the religious transformation could not be denied, and by the late 1530s the very identity of English Christianity bore the mark of his policies, leaving him both indispensable to the king and hated by many who saw their world overturned. A paradox that would in time contribute to his downfall, but in the moment underscored his unmatched influence, for no subject in living memory had so profoundly altered the faith of the English realm. While Thomas Cromwell reshaped religion and administration, one of his most enduring legacies lay in his command of Parliament, for he recognized earlier than most that statutes passed by the Commons and Lords could confer upon Henry VIII's actions an aura of legitimacy more powerful than proclamations or royal decrees alone, and though Parliament had traditionally been summoned only to grant taxation or confirm specific measures, Cromwell turned it into a regular engine of policy, framing legislation that not only endorsed the king's supremacy but also redefined the relationship between monarch, church, and people, and under his guidance the body evolved into a partner in transformation rather than a mere tool, with statutes carefully drafted to codify changes in succession, treason, and ecclesiastical governance, so that the revolution in church and state appeared not as the whim of one man but as the solemn decision of the nation assembled, a clever reframing that dulled some criticism while binding subjects more tightly to the new order. Cromwell's genius lay in his ability to manage the often unruly Commons, whose members included gentry deeply protective of local privilege, merchants wary of taxation, and clerics defending tradition, yet through preparation, persuasion, and occasionally intimidation he ensured that bills passed with remarkable speed, and he cultivated allies who could speak persuasively on the floor, provided drafts that left little room for alteration, and framed proposals as matters of necessity rather than choice, stressing the dangers of papal interference, the need for financial reform, or the urgency of securing the succession, and in doing so he not only guided debates but also trained Parliament to think of itself as an integral actor in governance, thereby setting precedents that would echo far beyond his fall, even if in his own time many resented the relentless pace and breadth of legislation forced upon them. Among his most significant achievements was the passage of the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declared Henry head of the Church of England, and the Treason Act that followed, defining denial of this supremacy as a capital crime, and these statutes did more than settle immediate disputes, they wove the new reality into the fabric of law, so that to resist was no longer only to defy the king but to break the law of the realm, a shift that made opposition far more perilous, and when critics such as Sir Thomas More or Bishop John Fisher refused compliance, it was Parliament's statutes that justified their executions, demonstrating how Cromwell's legislative machine converted dissent into treason, and while shocking to many, the logic was airtight in legal terms, binding conscience to obedience in ways that few had anticipated. Nor did Cromwell restrict Parliament's work to religion, for he pushed through acts regulating trade, defining poor relief, and authorizing new taxation, all while reshaping the rules of succession to favor Henry's shifting marital politics, and in every case he used Parliament not only to solve immediate problems but to assert that such decisions were grounded in collective consent, even if in practice that consent was carefully managed. And though some members complained privately of manipulation, others found opportunities to profit, particularly in the redistribution of monastic land, which created a new class of gentry invested in defending the changes, and thus Parliament became both a stage for Cromwell's policies and a mechanism for cementing their durability by tying the interests of landowners to the survival of reform. The sheer volume of legislation in the 1530s stunned contemporaries, leading some to call it a revolution in Parliament, and while later generations debated whether Cromwell truly intended to strengthen the institution or merely exploit it, the effect was undeniable. England emerged with a precedent that the most sweeping transformations should be enacted through statute, giving even royal absolutism a veneer of legal legitimacy, and though Cromwell's personal motives may have been pragmatic, rather than philosophical, his mastery of Parliament ensured that the upheavals of Henry's reign would not vanish with the king's death but would remain inscribed in law, binding future rulers and parliaments alike, and this legacy, born of his determination to control events through the authority of statute, made him at once the architect of Tudor revolution and, ironically, one of the fathers of parliamentary tradition. Beneath the surface of his public reforms, Thomas Cromwell maintained a quieter yet equally decisive instrument of power, his command of information, for in a realm still bound by personal loyalty and rumor, he cultivated a network of informants, clerks, and correspondents whose reports allowed him to anticipate threats, uncover opposition, and craft policies grounded in knowledge rather than guesswork. And while kings before him had relied on nobles for intelligence from their estates, Cromwell's genius was to bypass aristocratic channels by recruiting men of lower rank, parish priests, merchants, and travelers who could observe conditions in towns, monasteries, and ports, sending their findings back to Westminster in letters that passed through his office, so that by the mid-1530s Cromwell possessed a stream of information unlike anything England had seen before, a tapestry of whispers and reports that made him the best-informed man in the kingdom. He complemented this intelligence with a mastery of paperwork, for Cromwell believed that no detail was too small to record, and under his guidance clerks maintained registers of monastic wealth, inventories of land sales, and notes of conversations with foreign ambassadors, all organized so that data could be recalled when needed, and this bureaucratic memory gave him an advantage over rivals who relied on shifting recollection, enabling him to present Henry VIII with precise figures and arguments, which in turn enhanced his reputation as indispensable, for the king valued facts that could support his decisions, whether in dissolving monasteries or negotiating treaties, and Cromwell ensured that such facts always arrived on his desk first, carefully framed to align with royal desires. His methods extended beyond gathering knowledge into shaping it, for Cromwell understood the power of controlling what others believed, and he harnessed printing presses and royal proclamations to spread carefully crafted messages, ensuring that sermons, homilies, and pamphlets repeated the themes of obedience to king and law, while vilifying papal authority and monastic corruption, so that even in villages far from London people encountered echoes of Cromwell's policies in church and market. And though dissent could not be silenced entirely, the sheer repetition of these themes created a new atmosphere in which loyalty to the crown became the accepted norm, blurring the line between political obedience and religious faith, a conflation that suited his purposes perfectly. His control of information also made him feared, for nobles and clerics alike suspected that any careless word might reach Cromwell's ears, and his reputation as a master of spies ensured that even silence could seem dangerous, and while it is difficult to measure the actual extent of his surveillance, the perception alone was enough to curb open resistance, as men chose caution over rebellion. Yet this climate of fear also deepened resentment, for aristocrats felt humiliated that a man of low birth could monitor their words, while commoners sometimes whispered that England was ruled by Cromwell's informers rather than by the king, a charge he dismissed but could never fully dispel, for his strength lay in making himself the invisible thread binding center to periphery, knowledge to action, rumor to policy. In foreign affairs, too, his information networks proved invaluable, for he demanded constant reports from ambassadors and merchants abroad, and he cross-checked their accounts to prevent deception, giving him a sharper view of continental politics than many rivals, and he used this intelligence to advise Henry on alliances, marriages, and wars, often emphasizing the risks of entanglement while quietly promoting policies that secured England's independence, and though he could not prevent every miscalculation, his ability to frame debates with evidence made him a dominant voice in council, for others arrived with opinions while Cromwell came armed with reports, figures, and transcripts, which carried weight in a court where truth was slippery and rumor constant. Yet his reliance on information also carried dangers, for by inserting himself as the conduit of news to the king, Cromwell exposed himself to suspicion whenever events went awry, and rivals learned to hint that he suppressed inconvenient reports or colored facts to suit his agenda, and though often untrue, such accusations found fertile ground in a court that distrusted his rise, so that the very system that gave him strength also contained the seeds of vulnerability, but for much of the 1530s. His mastery of knowledge shielded him, making him appear less like a May minister and more like the indispensable mind that kept the kingdom coherent, and though his enemies sharpened their knives, they found it difficult to strike a man who seemed always to know what they plotted before they acted. As Thomas Cromwell's power grew to heights unimaginable for a man of his birth, so too did the number of enemies determined to see him fall, for Tudor politics was a world where advancement for one man often meant eclipse for another, and by the late 1530s Cromwell had outstripped not only fellow councillors but also noble families who traced their lineage back centuries, leaving them both humiliated and fearful of his dominance. And while Henry VIII continued to trust him, the king's affection was notoriously unstable, providing rivals with an opening to undermine Cromwell whenever fortune shifted, and chief among those rivals were the conservative faction at court, led by men such as the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner, who resented both his lowly origins and his religious reforms, viewing him as a dangerous heretic who threatened England's traditional faith, and they set themselves the task of exploiting every misstep to turn the king's favor into wrath. Norfolk, a proud aristocrat and military commander, embodied the old nobility's hatred for Cromwell, sneering that the blacksmith's son presumed to dictate policy to peers of the realm, and his contempt was sharpened by personal rivalry, for Cromwell's influence over patronage deprived the Norfolk family of appointments and revenues they considered their birthright, while Gardiner, skilled in law and theology, targeted Cromwell's religious changes, denouncing the spread of heretical books and the erosion of traditional practices, and together these men fashioned a narrative of Cromwell as a dangerous radical, hungry for power and eager to drag England into chaos, a story they fed quietly into the ears of courtiers who longed for the minister's ruin. And though Cromwell countered with his own network of allies, the gathering storm revealed how fragile his supremacy remained, for it depended less on consensus than on Henry's will, and the king's moods were as changeable as the tides. The failed uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 provided Cromwell's enemies with ammunition, for rebels in the north denounced him by name, blaming him for the dissolution of monasteries and the erosion of traditional faith. And while Henry's armies suppressed the revolt, whispers persisted at court that Cromwell's policies had provoked the unrest, an accusation Norfolk repeated whenever opportunity allowed, suggesting that the minister endangered the stability of the realm. And though Cromwell survived, the episode marked a turning point, for his name became indelibly associated with religious upheaval and social disquiet, and Henry, while still loyal, could not ignore that his servant inspired both loyalty and hatred on a national scale, a duality that placed Cromwell perpetually on the defensive even at the zenith of his power. Marriage politics added to his peril, for Cromwell had been instrumental in arranging the king's union with Anne Boleyn, and when she fell from grace and was executed in 1536, her enemies were quick to remind Henry of Cromwell's role, even though he had skillfully engineered her downfall to preserve himself. And later, when he promoted the match with Anne of Cleves in 1540, his opponents seized upon the king's disappointment with the bride to accuse Cromwell of incompetence and deceit, painting him as a reckless manipulator of royal marriage for his own ends. And while Henry's fury over the Cleves fiasco would erupt more fully later, the seeds of suspicion were sown long before, fertilized by rivals who understood that nothing could estrange a minister from his king more swiftly than the charge of meddling disastrously in the royal bedchamber. At the heart of Cromwell's vulnerability was his identity as an outsider, for no matter how high he climbed, he lacked the protection of noble kin, leaving him isolated when enemies circled. And while he distributed monastic lands to forge alliances with the gentry, the great aristocratic houses remained hostile, waiting for the chance to avenge their humiliation. And in council chambers, his blunt style and reliance on evidence often clashed with the cultivated courtesy of noblemen, deepening resentment, for they perceived his efficiency as arrogance and his merit as insolence. And though Cromwell's mastery of parliament, law, and finance kept him indispensable, the court was not governed solely by reason but by honor, pride, and favor, currencies in which his wealth of knowledge could not always compensate for the poverty of his pedigree. And as the 1530s gave way to the 1540s, the balance began to tilt, with enemies emboldened and allies less eager to defend a man increasingly portrayed as both tyrant and heretic. As Thomas Cromwell's ascendancy reached heights that astonished even his contemporaries, the backlash it provoked within the corridors of Henry VIII's court became increasingly intense, for in the fiercely competitive world of Tudor politics, every rung he climbed on the ladder of power represented a step downward for some noble rival. And by the late 1530s, the resentment that smoldered against him had coalesced into a formidable coalition of enemies, men and women who despised his low birth, loathed his religious policies, and feared his unprecedented control of royal decision-making, so that the court became a stage on which Cromwell's genius for survival was constantly tested against the jealousies and hatreds of the kingdom's most powerful families. And the irony was stark, for the very qualities that had raised him, his diligence, ruthlessness, and mastery of information, were the same that provoked his enemies to conspire, whisper, and maneuver ceaselessly for his destruction. Foremost among his adversaries stood Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a soldier of distinguished pedigree and the embodiment of noble pride, who regarded Cromwell as an upstart with no right to sit among gentlemen of ancient blood. And Norfolk's animosity was sharpened by the fact that Cromwell, wielding the machinery of patronage, blocked many of the Duke's ambitions, distributing lucrative offices and monastic lands not to the great houses but to loyal administrators and the rising gentry, thereby cutting into the traditional privileges of the aristocracy. And Norfolk, humiliated and marginalized, returned the slight with venom, seizing every chance to remind Henry that his blacksmith's son presumed to instruct dukes on matters of policy, a sneer that carried weight in a court where ancestry was currency. And his disdain was shared by many nobles who saw Cromwell's reforms not only as attacks on the old faith but also as calculated assaults on their political supremacy, a shift they found intolerable. Equally dangerous was Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, a man of learning, eloquence, and sharp instinct, who had once served as secretary to Wolsey and thus knew firsthand how a royal favorite could rise and fall, and Gardiner loathed Cromwell's religious agenda, regarding the spread of English Bibles, the dissolution of monasteries, and the erosion of papal ties as heresies threatening the soul of England. And though Cromwell himself was more pragmatic than doctrinaire, Gardiner painted him as a Lutheran radical, a schemer who clothed greed in the language of reform, and he whispered to conservatives at court that Cromwell's policies risked provoking God's wrath, stirring rebellion, and alienating European allies, and with every sermon railing against heresy, with every complaint of clerical dispossession, Gardiner found fuel to accuse Cromwell of endangering both church and state, accusations that carried force because they echoed the fears of many ordinary believers. Unsettled by the pace of change, the Rebellion of the North in 1536, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, provided Cromwell's enemies with potent ammunition, for tens of thousands of men marched beneath banners of the 5 Wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of monasteries and naming Cromwell directly as the chief villain behind England's sorrows. And though the revolt was suppressed, the fact that a minister's name, rather than the king's, became the focus of popular hatred was itself unprecedented, a sign that Cromwell's prominence had made him a lightning rod for discontent, and Norfolk, who helped negotiate the rebels' temporary dispersal, did not hesitate to remind Henry that the uprising had been inflamed by the minister's policies, while Gardiner added theological justification to the charge, insisting that Cromwell's meddling with the old religion had driven Englishmen to rebellion, and though Henry defended his servant for the moment, he could not ignore that disaffection in Cromwell's name had become tightly linked in the public imagination, a dangerous association for a courtier whose fortunes depended on royal trust. Marriage politics compounded the peril, for Cromwell had played a pivotal role in and Boleyn's downfall in 1536, skillfully managing the accusations and trials that removed her and opened the way for Jane Seymour. But such involvement carried risks, for though he rid himself of a queen who had turned against him, he also revealed his willingness to orchestrate the destruction of royalty, a precedent that unnerved courtiers and whispered into the king's ear the possibility that a minister who could destroy a queen might one day overreach in other ways. And later, when Cromwell championed the ill-fated marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves in 1540, his enemies saw their chance, for the king's distaste for his new bride quickly became common knowledge, and Norfolk and Gardiner were ready to remind Henry who had pressed the match, portraying Cromwell as a reckless manipulator of royal marriage who endangered the succession and mocked the king's dignity. Underlying all these grievances was Cromwell's essential vulnerability, his status as an outsider in a court where noble blood still defined legitimacy, for while his brilliance had secured him influence, he lacked the network of powerful kin who might shield him when storms broke, and though he distributed patronage generously, selling monastic lands to ambitious gentry and appointing loyal servants to offices, these alliances were transactional rather than ancestral, meaning they could wither under pressure, leaving him isolated in moments of crisis, and his bluntness in council did not help, for Cromwell often presented facts and figures with a candor that embarrassed noblemen accustomed to deference, earning him a reputation for arrogance, and his insistence on merit over lineage only deepened their fury, for in elevating clerks and lawyers, he seemed to invert the entire social order upon which their power rested. By the late 1530s, the conservative faction had refined a strategy of patient attrition, waiting for Cromwell to overreach, feeding Henry's suspicions with hints of heresy, treachery, or incompetence, and cultivating sympathy among courtiers who saw in Cromwell's fall the chance for their own advancement. And though Cromwell remained indispensable, controlling finances, parliament, and the machinery of reform, he could not escape the corrosive truth that his power rested on the shifting sands of royal favor, and that favor, however strong, could erode swiftly under the relentless tide of accusation, insinuation, and resentment, and in this precarious balance lay the seeds of his ruin, for no minister, however brilliant, could long survive when the court itself prayed for his destruction, and Cromwell's enemies, united by hatred if by nothing else, bided their time, sharpening their daggers for the moment when opportunity aligned with Henry's wrath, a moment that, as the 1540s dawned, drew ever closer. When Anne Boleyn's star began to dim in 1536, Thomas Cromwell, who had once allied himself with her to push forward reforms, recognized that her growing conflict with the king placed his own survival in peril, and though posterity has often debated whether he engineered her downfall out of ambition, revenge, or cold pragmatism, what is clear is that Cromwell understood better than anyone that Henry VIII's affection, once soured, could transform into fury as lethal as a sword, and thus he maneuvered with quiet precision, listening, gathering intelligence, and waiting for the moment when his actions might align perfectly with the king's shifting desires, for in a court where queens could fall as swiftly as ministers, his task was to ensure that Anne's destruction did not engulf him too, and that the ruin of one queen could secure the foundations of his own power. Anne's position had grown precarious by the spring of that year, for though she had given Henry a daughter, the future Elizabeth, she had failed to provide the longed-for son, and her sharp wit, which once entranced the king, now grated upon him, while Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting of quiet demeanor and unassuming charm, caught Henry's wandering eye, and Anne's enemies, who included the conservative faction led by Norfolk and Gardiner, whispered daily that her arrogance alienated noble families and her Lutheran sympathies threatened the ancient faith, and Cromwell, who had quarreled with her over the spoils of monastic dissolution, saw in her decline an opportunity not merely for personal vengeance but also for political consolidation, for by removing her, he could appease conservatives, please the Seymours, and bind himself still tighter to Henry's favor. The method of her removal required care, for Henry had once defied popes and kingdoms for Anne, and to charge her with mere failure in marriage would not suffice, so Cromwell devised a case rooted in treason, the gravest of crimes, and began to orchestrate the gathering of evidence, calling upon informants, servants, and courtiers, weaving together testimonies of flirtation, ambiguous gestures, and careless remarks until they formed a tapestry of accusation, and in this tapestry he included not only minor courtiers but also musicians and men of rank, even Henry Norris, one of the king's closest companions, for the greater the men accused, the greater the shock to Anne's reputation, and by painting her as a seductress who entangled nobles in webs of treasonous lust, Cromwell ensured that the charge would wound Henry in his pride as husband and king, transforming private disappointment into public outrage. The trials unfolded with merciless efficiency, for in Tudor justice the outcome often preceded the evidence, and Anne's enemies dominated the juries, while Cromwell's hand guided the framing of charges, presenting stories of moonlit meetings, secret gifts, and whispered confessions, and though the accused protested innocence, their fates were sealed, and the spectacle of noblemen and musicians condemned for adultery with the queen shocked the court. Yet it also titillated, for scandal fed gossip like blood-fed wolves, and when Anne herself was arraigned in May, she stood with proud defiance, denying all charges, but her words carried little weight against the tide of orchestrated condemnation, and Cromwell, watching from the shadows, knew that the drama played not only on the stage of Westminster Hall but also in Henry's heart, where betrayal, once believed, burned hotter than truth could quench. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green, the first Queen of England to be beheaded, and her fall sent tremors across Europe, for she had been the symbol of England's break with Rome, and her destruction suggested that even queens were but pawns in Henry's relentless game of power and succession, and Cromwell emerged from the wreckage stronger than ever, rewarded with titles and trust, for the king praised his minister's skill in ridding him of a troublesome wife, and foreign ambassadors marveled at the swiftness with which a queen could be unmade, a testament to Cromwell's ruthless efficiency. Yet beneath the triumph lay risks, for in orchestrating Anne's downfall he had displayed not only loyalty to Henry but also his own capacity for manipulation, a reminder to the court that Cromwell was a man who could topple even a queen, and such power, though it secured his position, also planted the seeds of fear among allies and enemies alike. For Elizabeth, the infant daughter left behind, her mother's fall might have spelled obscurity, but destiny would later lift her to greatness, though at the time, her bastardization reinforced the urgency of Jane Seymour's ascendancy, and Cromwell, who had facilitated the transition, basked in the glow of royal gratitude, ensuring that his reforms would continue under the cover of his strengthened influence. Yet the memory of Anne's execution lingered as a shadow, a demonstration that in Henry's England no bond, however intimate, was safe from the axe when politics demanded blood, and for Cromwell himself, the triumph of 1536 stood as both a pinnacle and a warning, for by proving himself indispensable, he also revealed the dangerous reach of his hand, and in courts where envy ruled as much as loyalty, such reach could one day be grasped and broken, as easily as he had broken Anne. The greatest test of Thomas Cromwell's power came not in courtly intrigue but in open rebellion, when in the autumn of 1536 the north of England erupted in what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, a vast popular uprising against the dissolution of monasteries, the new religious policies, and the centralization of authority, and though Henry VIII styled himself as God's chosen ruler, it was Cromwell's reforms that bore the brunt of northern fury, for in the eyes of thousands of commoners, gentry, and even clerics, He represented the destruction of their traditions, their livelihoods, and their faith, and banners emblazoned with the 5 wounds of Christ marched across the countryside as men swore oaths to defend the old religion and demanded not only the restoration of abbeys but also the removal of Cromwell himself, whose name was cursed in market squares and churchyards as the architect of misery. The uprising began in Lincolnshire but quickly spread to Yorkshire and beyond, drawing tens of thousands into its ranks, and unlike sporadic riots of the past, this movement bore the discipline of an army, led by Robert Aske, a lawyer of noble bearing who framed the rebellion not as treason but as a pilgrimage, a holy endeavor to restore truth and justice to the realm, and under his guidance the rebels maintained remarkable order, avoiding pillage and violence where possible, even swearing loyalty to Henry while denouncing Cromwell, Richard Rich, and the king's evil counselors, a formulation that allowed them to channel their grievances at the minister rather than the monarch, a subtle but potent strategy that placed Cromwell in the direct line of their fury while still professing loyalty to the sovereign they hoped to persuade. For Cromwell, the rebellion struck at the heart of his ambitions, for the monasteries not only represented wealth but also the financial engine of his reforms, and their destruction funded the crown's independence from Rome and its wars abroad. Yet to the people of the North, abbeys were more than stones. They were centers of charity, hospitals, schools, and spiritual anchors, and the closure of these houses tore at the social fabric, leaving the poor destitute and communities bereft of ancient ties. And though Cromwell could frame the dissolution as a blow against corruption and superstition, the lived experience of villagers was hunger, uncertainty, and the loss of sacred continuity, and so their anger boiled over in chants that echoed across the ridings, carrying his name as a curse. Henry, alarmed at the scale of the rebellion, initially wavered, for the royal army seemed too small to face tens of thousands, and he sent the Duke of Norfolk north to negotiate, a mission fraught with danger. Yet Cromwell, watching from London, calculated that the king's word could be wielded as both shield and snare, and Norfolk promised the rebels pardon, a parliament to air grievances, and consideration of their demands, and with such assurances Robert Aske led his followers to disperse, believing the king a man of honor. But in this trust lay the seeds of tragedy, for once the rebellion dissolved and the North quieted, Henry and Cromwell had no intention of yielding, and within months the promises were reversed, leaders were arrested, and harsh retribution followed. By the spring of 1537, gallows loomed over northern towns, and Robert Aske himself was hanged in chains, a grim warning to those who would challenge the crown, while lesser rebels were executed by the hundreds, their bodies left to rot as symbols of royal vengeance, and Cromwell, though absent from a battlefield, emerged as the villain in the eyes of survivors. For his policies had sparked the revolt and his influence had ensured its bloody suppression, and though Henry publicly claimed the mantle of justice, it was Cromwell who gained the reputation of ruthless enforcer, a man willing to sacrifice thousands to secure the king's supremacy, and while in political terms the rebellion ended in triumph for crown and minister alike, the scars it left upon the northern counties endured for generations, a deep reservoir of distrust towards southern government and the Reformation's architects. For Cromwell personally, the Pilgrimage of Grace demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of his power, for though the rebels demanded his removal and though his name became synonymous with tyranny in popular memory, his position at court was paradoxically strengthened, for Henry, who had been shaken by the scale of resistance, leaned ever more heavily on the minister who could supply both funds and strategies to prevent future uprisings, and Cromwell's ability to turn crisis into consolidation revealed his unmatched political instinct, yet it also revealed a pattern. Every victory came at the cost of deepening enmity, and each new act of control sowed resentment that would one day find its way back to him, and in this sense the Pilgrimage of Grace was not only a rebellion of its own moment, but also a foreshadowing of Cromwell's eventual fall. For the anger that he quelled with gallows would resurface in whispers at court, where noble rivals remembered how easily he became the scapegoat of the people. In the aftermath of the Pilgrimage of Grace, Thomas Cromwell emerged not weakened but ascendant, for his orchestration of suppression, his management of negotiations, and his ability to secure Henry's supremacy convinced the king that no minister had ever served him with such loyalty and effectiveness, and as a reward for his steadfastness, Henry granted him unprecedented titles, most notably that of vicegerent in spirituals, a position that effectively made him the king's deputy in all matters of religion, placing him above even archbishops and bishops, and in this role Cromwell stood as the living embodiment of the break with Rome, the channel through which royal supremacy flowed into every pulpit, every monastery, and every parish, so that when priests preached loyalty to the crown, it was Cromwell's directives they echoed, and when abbots surrendered their houses, it was his agents they faced, and this authority, unparalleled in English history, elevated him to a zenith where his word could topple prelates, redirect revenues, and silence dissent. As vicegerent, Cromwell's power was both spiritual and temporal, for he chaired the newly created Court of Augmentations, which oversaw the lands and wealth seized from dissolved monasteries, and this gave him immense control over patronage, for he could grant estates to loyal supporters, enrich gentry families eager to buy monastic lands, and ensure that reform was not only ideological but also financial, binding new elites to the cause of reformation through property. And in this redistribution lay the seeds of a transformed England, for ancient monastic holdings passed into lay hands, altering landscapes, local economies, and political alignments, while Cromwell himself oversaw the valuation and sale with meticulous attention, ensuring that no penny escaped the crown's grasp, and though critics accused him of avarice, he viewed the process as a necessary revolution, redirecting wealth from idle clerics to a monarch who could wield it for the strength of the realm. Cromwell's influence extended beyond land and wealth into doctrine and worship, for as vicegerent he authorized the spread of English Bibles, encouraged preachers to denounce papal authority, and promoted homilies that celebrated obedience to king and crown, and in these measures he revealed his own Protestant leanings, for though cautious in pace to avoid further rebellion, he fostered a generation of reform-minded clergy who looked to him as protector, and in Parliament his allies pushed forward statutes that codified changes, while in convocation his authority loomed over debates, silencing opposition with the weight of royal supremacy, so that by the late 1530s, England's church bore little resemblance to the Catholic institution of 2 decades earlier, and though Henry himself remained conservative in theology, it was Cromwell's machinery that carried the Reformation's momentum, sometimes even beyond what the king himself intended. Foreign courts marveled and recoiled at his power, for ambassadors reported that Cromwell's word carried more weight than dukes or bishops, and in Germany and Switzerland reformers looked upon him as an English Moses, guiding a nation out of papal bondage, while in Rome he was reviled as a heretic and destroyer, his name cursed alongside Luther's, and yet this notoriety only sharpened his stature, for he thrived on the perception that he alone held the keys to Henry's policy, and his rise from blacksmith's son to near ecclesiastical overlord astonished contemporaries, provoking envy and admiration in equal measure, and even as noble families whispered against him, they sought his favor, for he controlled the lands, the laws, and the preaching, and his shadow stretched from Westminster to every village green where sermons declared the supremacy of Henry, and thus of Cromwell's office. But zeniths in Tudor England were precarious, for power that reached such heights inevitably stirred resistance, and while Cromwell reigned as vicegerent, the very scope of his authority made him vulnerable, for bishops chafed at being overruled by a layman, nobles resented his control over patronage, and Henry himself, though delighted by the wealth and order Cromwell provided, disliked being overshadowed, for he was a king who brooked no rivals, and the spectacle of a minister wielding authority greater than lords spiritual or temporal raised unease in a court already suspicious of Cromwell's Protestant ties, and though his star blazed at its brightest in these years, every flame that burns high casts long shadows, and already, beyond the glow of triumph, the outlines of his downfall began to stir. At the very height of his influence, when his hand directed the wealth of monasteries and his authority overshadowed even bishops, Thomas Cromwell undertook the decision that would prove both his boldest gamble and the beginning of his ruin, the negotiation of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose alliance promised to knit England into the Protestant network of Northern Europe. And in this project Cromwell sought not only to strengthen the Reformation, but also to secure England's safety against the looming Catholic powers of France and Spain, who, though rivals, remained united in hostility to Henry's break with Rome, and by binding his king to the Lutheran princes of Germany through marriage, Cromwell envisioned a bulwark of Protestant solidarity, a diplomatic chess move that would anchor England in a broader movement and protect his reforms from reversal. For he knew that foreign alliances could be as decisive as domestic statutes in securing the future of the new church. The proposal was not without merit, for Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had wearied of England's independence, while Francis I of France watched for opportunities to exploit divisions, and in such a climate the Protestant states of Germany, united in the Schmalkaldic League, offered potential allies who might balance the European scales, and Cromwell, who had corresponded with reformers abroad, believed fervently that the future lay with such unions, and thus when the prospect of a Cleves marriage emerged, He pressed it upon Henry with urgency, presenting portraits of and painted by Hans Holbein, extolling her virtues of modesty and piety, and emphasizing the strategic advantage her family's alliance would yield. And Henry, though not easily persuaded in matters of matrimony after his bitter experiences, allowed himself to be convinced, for Cromwell's counsel had rarely failed him before, and the prospect of isolating Rome and Spain through Protestant kinship appealed to his pride as well as his security. Yet the gamble carried risks that Cromwell underestimated, for Henry, though pragmatic in politics, was vain in his personal desires, and when Anne of Cleves arrived in England in the winter of 1539, the king, meeting her at Rochester, recoiled in disappointment, for the woman before him did not match the idealized portrait he had admired, and he declared bitterly that she was no maid of beauty, mocking her figure and her manners, and though Anne herself behaved with dignity, the damage was done. For Henry, who valued passion as much as policy, felt deceived, and suspicion turned not upon the princess but upon the minister who had arranged the match, and from that moment, what had been intended as Cromwell's crowning achievement became the fault line upon which his enemies would later build their case for his destruction. The marriage went forward nonetheless, for diplomacy and ceremony had advanced too far to retreat, and on January 6, 1540, Henry wedded at Greenwich, yet the union was never consummated, and the king, disgusted and humiliated, confided to intimates that he could not bring himself to touch her, and in his complaints lay not only the bitterness of personal dissatisfaction but also the seeds of political betrayal. For Cromwell, once the architect of triumph, was now the scapegoat of failure, and his rivals, who had long resented his dominance, circled with renewed vigor, whispering that he had tricked the king, that he had advanced her for her Protestant connections rather than her worthiness as a bride, and that his loyalties lay as much with reformist Germany as with the honor of England's monarch, and Henry, in his wounded pride, began to listen. Meanwhile, Cromwell, still convinced of the alliance's value, pressed ahead with his reforming agenda, introducing further measures that pushed the church toward Protestant practices, promoting English liturgy, distributing Bibles, and supporting preachers who challenged traditional doctrine, and in this acceleration his enemies saw opportunity, for the king, though content to wield supremacy over Rome, remained conservative in faith, cherishing many Catholic traditions, and when Cromwell pushed too far, combining a failed marriage with a theological drift Henry did not fully endorse, the stage was set for his undoing, for in the eyes of his rivals, he had overreached, binding his fate to a woman the king despised and a religious policy the king only half embraced, and so the triumph of his zenith transformed into the gamble that toppled him, for when a king feels deceived in his bed and betrayed in his chapel, no minister, however great, can long survive. By the summer of 1540, Thomas Cromwell, who had risen from the forge of a blacksmith's son to become the architect of England's revolution, stood at the height of apparent power, for he bore the titles of Earl of Essex, Lord Great Chamberlain, and Vicegerent in spirituals, yet beneath the glitter of honor the ground had begun to crumble, for Henry's disgust with Anne of Cleves had curdled into resentment toward the man who arranged the match, and Cromwell's enemies, long kept at bay, scented blood, gathering around Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, who whispered to the king that his minister was a heretic, a traitor, and a deceiver, more loyal to Luther's cause than to England's, and though Henry had relied on Cromwell to enforce his will for a decade, he was a monarch of caprice, who could exult in the morning and destroy by night, and in Cromwell's fate this volatility reached its fullest expression. The first signs of collapse came in Parliament, when Norfolk's faction began to sow doubts about Cromwell's orthodoxy, pointing to his patronage of reformist preachers, his support for English liturgy, and his correspondence with German reformers, and though Cromwell sought to steady himself by intensifying his loyalty to the king, even arranging for Henry to court Catherine Howard, Norfolk's young and Catholic niece, his efforts could not erase the blot of Cleves, nor the perception that he had manipulated the king into an unwelcome union, and on June 10, 1540, as he sat unsuspecting in council, Norfolk and his allies struck, producing charges of treason and heresy, and Henry, swayed by anger, allowed the arrest to proceed, so that Cromwell, once the master of council chambers, was seized in the very room where he had commanded for years, his staff broken, his seals of office torn away, and his enemies exulted as he was dragged to the Tower, stunned by the swiftness with which his fortunes had turned. In the Tower, Cromwell, who had once sent queens, bishops, and nobles to their deaths, now awaited his own, writing letters to Henry that pleaded for mercy, proclaiming his loyalty and reminding the king of his long service, and in one desperate appeal he signed himself, "Your most bounden and most obedient poor servant and daily orator." But the words fell upon deaf ears, for Henry, already intoxicated with Catherine Howard's youth and charm, had no wish to recall the man who had given him Anne of Cleves, and though Cromwell's fall shocked even those who hated him, for they had feared his power too greatly to imagine his ruin, once his star was broken few dared defend him, and his isolation was complete, the fate of every Tudor minister who flew too near the sun of royal favor. The charges against him were a patchwork of accusation, including heresy, for his promotion of Protestant doctrine, and treason, for allegedly supporting foreign reformers against the crown, yet no trial offered him a chance of defense, for Parliament passed a bill of attainder condemning him without hearing, a tool he himself had wielded against others, now turned upon him, and so the machinery of law that he had mastered became the instrument of his destruction, and the irony was not lost on those who watched for Cromwell, who had framed statutes of treason so wide that conscience itself could be criminal, now found himself ensnared by the same net, condemned by whispers and suspicions that in calmer times might have been dismissed, yet in Tudor politics law served power, and the power had shifted irreversibly against him. On July 28, 1540, the day chosen for his execution, Cromwell was brought to Tower Hill, where crowds gathered to witness the downfall of the man once thought invincible, and he mounted the scaffold with composure, delivering a final speech in which he professed loyalty to the king and faith in Christ, careful to avoid the appearance of heresy, and those who listened remarked upon his humility. For he who had been feared for ruthlessness now spoke with the resignation of one who knew the wheel of fortune had turned, and kneeling to the block, he stretched out his arms, offering his head to the axe, and with a single stroke his life ended, the ruthless mastermind who had remade England falling at last beneath the same blade that had silenced so many at his command. On that same day, in a grotesque symmetry, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, celebrating new passion even as Cromwell's body was dispatched, and foreign ambassadors marveled at the king's inconstancy, how he could destroy a servant of 10 years in the morning and feast at a wedding in the evening, and the court, though shocked, adapted swiftly, for in Henry's England survival required forgetting the fallen, and Cromwell's estates were seized, his titles forfeited, his enemies triumphant. Yet, the victory carried its own ironies, for though they rejoiced in his death, the structures he had built, the supremacy of the crown, the dissolution of monasteries, the binding of Parliament to royal will, endured, and his ghost lingered in every statute and sermon that bore the imprint of his hand. Thus ended the career of Thomas Cromwell, blacksmith's son, soldier, merchant, lawyer, minister, and architect of revolution, whose rise embodied the promise of talent in a rigid society, and whose fall revealed the peril of serving a king whose favor was as fleeting as summer rain, and though his enemies mocked him as a heretic and upstart, history judged him as one of the most formidable statesmen of Tudor England, a man whose vision reshaped monarchy, church, and law, and whose death, though brutal, could not erase the changes he wrought, for England would never again be the realm it had been before his hand steered its course, and in the silence after the axe, the legacy of Thomas Cromwell endured, carved into the bones of a kingdom that had been our. Thank you for watching this dramatic account of Thomas Cromwell's final days. His legacy shaped England long after his death, a reminder of power's peril and history's enduring lessons. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories of the Tudors and the age they transformed forever.